Clarabelle lay face down in the burning sand, her tattered dress offering scant protection against the relentless sun. The raw welts around her wrists throbbed with each pulse of her racing heart, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from a thirst that gnawed at her insides. Since dawn, she had been a prisoner of the desert, betrayed by the very man who had sworn to deliver her to freedom. 3 hours ago, she had placed her trust in Samuel Crenshaw, a smooth-talking charmer who promised escape from the arranged marriage her cruel guardian had forced upon her. He had painted a vivid picture of a new life in a distant town, a life filled with independence and choice. But as soon as they reached the desolate expanse of the desert, Samuel's mask slipped, revealing the predator beneath. His honeyed words turned to bitter demands, his gentle smile twisting into a menacing sneer when she bravely rejected his unwanted advances. "So you think you are too good for me, huh?" he had hissed, his grip like a vice on her delicate wrists. "Let us see how long your pride lasts under the desert's kiss." With cruel efficiency, he bound her to the skeletal remains of a mesquite tree and vanished over the horizon, leaving her to face a slow and agonizing death. Clara screamed until her throat was raw, wrestled against the unforgiving ropes until her wrists bled, but all her efforts were in vain. Now, only silence and despair remained, a suffocating blanket against the backdrop of the unforgiving desert. The desert stretched out before her, an endless ocean of shimmering heat and death. Mirage-like figures danced on the horizon, mocking her desperate longing for salvation. Vultures circled patiently above, their dark silhouettes etched against the blazing sky, waiting for the inevitable. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, attempting to conjure a prayer. But even her faith seemed to wither and die in this forsaken wasteland. Little did she know that, less than a mile away, another soul was engaged in a desperate battle for survival. A soul whose path would soon intertwine with her own in a twist of fate. Ayanna, a seasoned war chief of the mountain Apache, pressed a blood-soaked hand against the gaping arrow wound in his shoulder. Each breath sent searing pain through his body, but he pressed on, urging his weary horse toward a hidden waterhole nestled among the rugged rocks. The soldiers from the nearby fort had broken the treaty once more, ambushing his small hunting party without provocation. 3 of his bravest warriors lay dead, their blood staining the desert sands. 2 more were gravely wounded, and now Ayanna rode alone, his vision blurring from blood loss and exhaustion, his only goal to reach the sanctuary of his village. His horse stumbled, nearly unseating him. The loyal creature was as spent as he was, its flanks heaving and foam gathering at its parched mouth. They could not continue much further without water. Ayanna squinted through the shimmering heat haze, searching for the familiar landmarks that would guide him to the spring. That is when he saw her, a solitary figure in a pale dress, lying motionless against a withered tree. Initially, he dismissed it as a cruel hallucination, a trick of the dying mind. But as he drew closer, he detected the faint rise and fall of her chest, the undeniable sign of life. Someone was out there, clinging to existence against all odds. Every survival instinct screamed at him to ride past, to ignore the desperate plea and focus on his own survival. The white settlers were his people's sworn enemies, and this could be a carefully laid trap. His wound was severe, and he had to reach his village before the encroaching infection consumed him. Yet something deeper, something primal, compelled him to halt his weary horse. The girl appeared no older than 17, her face obscured by matted hair and dirt. The unmistakable marks of rope burns on her wrists spoke of a brutal betrayal, a story of heartless cruelty that Ayanna knew all too well. He had witnessed his own people abandoned to suffer by those they trusted, left to perish in the face of overwhelming power. Clara's eyes fluttered open as a shadow fell across her face, momentarily eclipsing the blinding sun. She expected to see the grotesque faces of the waiting vultures, but instead, she found herself gazing up at a figure unlike any she had ever encountered. His skin was bronzed and weathered from years under the scorching sun, his long black hair framing a face etched with both profound wisdom and enduring pain. Blood stained his buckskin shirt, a testament to a fierce battle, and his dark, piercing eyes held an ancient depth that seemed to steal her very breath. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. The Apache chief and the abandoned girl locked in a silent exchange across the chasm of fear and mistrust. Clara had grown up on terrifying tales of his people, stories of unimaginable violence and unchecked savagery whispered by white mothers to keep their children obedient. But the man who knelt before her bore no resemblance to those horrifying caricatures. Ayanna, in turn, saw something unexpected reflected in her desperate eyes. Not hatred or fear, but a profound recognition of shared suffering. This girl knew the soul-crushing weight of betrayal, the agony of being abandoned and broken by those who should have shielded her from harm. He should ride away, must ride away. His own life depended on reaching his village and receiving the healing care of his people. But as Clara's parched lips trembled, struggling to form a coherent word, as her eyes pleaded for a mercy she had no right to expect, Ayanna made a fateful choice, a decision that would irrevocably bind their destinies together. He dismounted slowly and deliberately, his wound erupting in a symphony of excruciating pain. Clara watched in stunned silence as the Apache chief knelt beside her and began to gently work at the knots that held her captive. His touch was surprisingly tender, mindful of the raw and inflamed skin beneath the ropes. But what neither of them could possibly anticipate was that Samuel Crenshaw had not ridden as far as they believed. Consumed by a simmering rage and a burning desire for retribution, he had doubled back to ensure his discarded prize met her end. When he spotted the Apache chief freeing his intended victim, a dark fury consumed him, setting into motion a chain of events that would plunge them all into a whirlwind of danger. The ropes finally gave way, falling limply from Clara's abused wrists, but her fleeting moment of relief was quickly shattered. Ayanna's head snapped up, his warrior instincts honed by years of conflict, sensing an impending threat even before his ears registered the sound. The unmistakable thunder of approaching hoofbeats, growing louder with each passing second, coming fast from the direction of town. "Can you stand?" His English was surprisingly clear, though tinged with a subtle accent, each word carefully chosen and deliberately enunciated. Clara attempted to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her, betraying her weakened state. Hours of exposure to the merciless desert sun had sapped her of every last ounce of strength. Without hesitation, Ayanna swept her up into his arms, cradling her against his chest. The sudden movement sent a jolt of white-hot pain through his injured shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and carried her toward his waiting horse. Clara felt the surprising strength in his arms, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and a flicker of hope ignited within her, mending something that had been irrevocably broken. "3 riders," Ayanna muttered, his gaze sweeping across the horizon, searching for the approaching threat. "They see us." Clara's blood turned to ice. She knew exactly who was coming. Samuel had not been content to let the desert claim her. He had returned with reinforcements, no doubt fabricating a story of her abduction by hostile natives to rally support and ensure his twisted version of justice prevailed. It would be his word against theirs, and in this world, no one would ever believe an Apache chief over a respected white man. "They will kill you," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "Samuel has told them I was kidnapped. They will not listen to the truth." Ayanna's jaw tightened, his face hardening with grim determination. He had survived for 35 years by reading the subtle language of danger etched on men's faces, and he recognized the unmistakable hunger for violence in these approaching riders. They craved Apache blood, and any excuse, no matter how flimsy, would serve as justification for their bloodlust. His horse was already near exhaustion, he was severely wounded, and the girl could barely stand. Flight was simply not an option. Fighting 3 armed men in his weakened condition would be suicidal, but surrender meant certain death for both of them. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble as he gently helped Clara onto his horse. "Clarabelle," she managed to croak, her voice raw and hoarse from thirst. "Clarabelle," he repeated, as if savoring the sound of the unfamiliar word. "I am Ayanna. If we are destined to die this day, at least we will not die as strangers." The riders were close enough now that Clara could discern Samuel's triumphant face beneath the brim of his hat. He was smiling, a chilling display of malice that made her stomach churn. Beside him rode two men she recognized from town, Marcus Webb and Dutch Kellerman, both notorious for their virulent hatred of the Apache and their hair-trigger tempers. Samuel raised his hand, signaling the others to slow their pace. They formed a semicircle around Ayanna and Clara, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed, savoring the moment before the kill. The game had not officially begun, but everyone understood the unspoken rules. "Well, well," Samuel called out, his voice dripping with false joviality, carrying clearly in the still desert air. "Looks like we have found ourselves an Indian trying to steal white women. That is a hanging offense where I come from." Ayanna remained silent, his face an impassive mask. He kept his hands in plain sight, deliberately away from the hunting knife concealed at his belt, signaling his intention to avoid conflict. Clara felt the tension radiating from him, the coiled energy of a powerful predator forced to feign the role of prey. "She ain't stolen," Marcus spat, a stream of tobacco juice staining his unkempt beard. "Look at her, all torn up and scared. That Apache savage probably had his way with her already." Clara's face burned with shame and a simmering rage. "That is not true. He saved me. Samuel, tell them what you did." Samuel's laugh was as cold and devoid of warmth as a winter wind. "Poor thing has been in the sun too long, rambling nonsense. Everyone knows you cannot trust what a woman says when she has been through trauma like this." Dutch nodded gravely, feigning concern. "It is a terrible thing what these savages do to Christian women. We should put her out of her misery. It would probably be a mercy." The words hit Clara like a series of physical blows, each one driving deeper than the last. They were not simply planning to murder Ayanna, they were going to execute her as well, cloaking their barbarity in the guise of righteous justice. She could see it in their eyes, in the way they looked at her now, as if she were already dead, her honor permanently tarnished beyond redemption. "You are lying," she said, but her voice lacked conviction, lost in the vastness of the desert. Who would believe her? A poor orphan girl with no family, no protection, no value to anyone. Ayanna shifted slightly, instinctively positioning himself between Clara and the menacing barrels of their guns. She felt his hand brush against hers, a fleeting touch that was surprisingly warm and steady. In that simple gesture, she discovered something she had never experienced before. Someone willing to risk everything, even their own life, for her sake. "The girl speaks the truth," Ayanna said quietly, his voice resonating with an undeniable authority. "I found her tied to the tree. She was left to die." Samuel's face darkened, his carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. "Are you calling me a liar, Chief? I will call you what you are." The silence that followed stretched as taut as a bowstring, thick with unspoken threats. Clara could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart, smell the acrid scent of sweat and leather, and the metallic tang of weapons poised to kill. 3 armed men against 1 wounded Apache warrior and a defenseless girl. The odds could not be more stacked against them. But Samuel was not satisfied with a simple, swift execution. He needed to savor his victory, to torment his prey before delivering the final blow. "Tell you what, Chief," he said, dismounting slowly and deliberately, his eyes locked on Clara. "You release the girl. You ride out of here peaceful-like, and maybe, just maybe, we will let you live. She comes with us. We will take her back to town where she belongs. Everyone wins." Clara felt Ayanna's muscles tense beneath her grip. They both understood what taking her back to town truly meant. Samuel would claim she had been rescued, traumatized, and in dire need of his protection. With no family to object, no one to speak for her, she would vanish into whatever personal hell he had so meticulously planned. "The girl stays with me," Ayanna said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Samuel's smile widened, revealing a glimpse of the darkness that lurked within him. "Now that is interesting. An Apache chief getting attached to white girls makes a man wonder what other crimes you have been up to." Marcus and Dutch spread out, flanking them, effectively cutting off any avenue of escape. Their horses snorted and pawed at the ground, sensing the impending violence that hung heavy in the air. Clara realized with crystal clarity that she was about to witness the demise of the only person who had ever attempted to save her, and it would be her fault. The thought was unbearable, a burden too heavy to carry. She opened her mouth to order Ayanna to leave her, to save himself while he still could, but before she could utter a single word, something unexpected unfolded, something that would forever alter the course of their lives. A rifle shot cracked across the desolate landscape, echoing through the stillness, but it did not originate from Samuel or his men. The bullet struck the sand between the horses, sending them into a frenzy of panicked movement. Everyone whirled around, their weapons swinging wildly as they desperately searched for the unseen shooter. On a distant ridge, silhouetted against the blazing sky, stood a lone figure. Even from this distance, Clara could make out the glint of a rifle barrel and the unmistakable lines of an Apache war dress. Ayanna's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Nalnish," he called out in his native tongue, his voice filled with relief. "Brother." The voice that answered was strong and commanding, carrying the weight of authority. "Ayanna, are you harmed?" Samuel's face drained of color as he grasped the gravity of their situation. One wounded Apache was a manageable threat, but if there were more warriors concealed on the ridge, if this was a coordinated war party, their prospects for survival plummeted. Dutch whispered, his gun hand visibly trembling. Ayanna spoke again in Apache, his words flowing like a river over smooth stones. Clara could not decipher the language, but she detected the steely resolve beneath his calm tone. This was not a friendly exchange. It was a negotiation for their lives. The warrior on the ridge responded, and Clara thought she detected a hint of questioning in his tone. Ayanna glanced down at her, then spoke again, his voice conveying a sense of finality. "What is he saying?" Marcus demanded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the oppressive heat. Ayanna's dark eyes locked onto Samuel's, his gaze unwavering. "I told my brother that these men left a young woman to die in the desert. I told him that one of them tried to force himself on her when she refused his advances." Samuel's hand instinctively moved toward his gun. "That is a damn lie." "I told him," Ayanna continued, his voice never rising, "that this man tied her to a tree and left her for the vultures because she would not submit to his desires." The warrior on the ridge spoke again, and this time Clara could sense the raw anger simmering beneath his words, even without understanding the language. Samuel had turned a sickly shade of gray, finally comprehending the full horror of his predicament. "And what did your brother say to that?" Clara asked softly, her voice barely audible. Ayanna's smile was as sharp and unforgiving as a honed blade. "He said that among my people, men who abuse women in such a way are not considered men at all. They are considered animals, and animals are hunted." The rifle on the ridge swung toward Samuel. Dutch and Marcus began to slowly back their horses away, their expressions betraying their realization that their loyalty to Samuel had definite limits. "Now wait just a minute," Samuel sputtered, his voice laced with desperation. "You cannot believe the word of some hysterical girl over the word of a man," Ayanna interrupted, his voice cutting through Samuel's protests like a knife. "Clarabelle, show them your wrists." With trembling hands, Clara raised her arms, displaying the gruesome evidence of her torment. The raw, inflamed rope burns that circled her wrists like bloody bracelets. The physical manifestation of his cruelty was undeniable, written in her blood and her pain. "Those could have come from anywhere," Samuel stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Remove your shirt," Ayanna ordered Clara gently, his voice devoid of any hint of impropriety. Clara's eyes widened in shock. I cannot. Trust me." With trembling fingers, Clara pulled aside the torn fabric of her dress, revealing her shoulders and back. Samuel's handiwork was clearly visible. The ugly, finger-shaped bruises where he had grabbed her, the angry scratches left from her desperate fight for survival. Marcus cursed under his breath, averting his gaze. Dutch spat in the sand and shook his head in disgust. Even these hardened men had limits, and Samuel had clearly crossed them. "Jesus, Sam," Marcus muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. "What the hell did you do?" Samuel's carefully constructed composure finally shattered, revealing the ugly truth that lay beneath. She is nothing, a nobody, an orphan with no family, no protection. Who is going to miss her? The callous words hung in the desert air like a chilling confession. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from pain or fear, but from a burning rage. He had just confirmed everything Ayanna had accused him of, validating every act of violence and betrayal. But Samuel was not finished digging his own grave. Besides, he continued, desperation fueling his recklessness, what is one less mouth to feed? The girl has been nothing but trouble since her parents died. At least this way she would have been useful for something. The rifle shot from the ridge whizzed so close to Samuel's head that it singed the hair beneath his hat. His horse reared violently, nearly throwing him from the saddle. "Next shot will not miss," Ayanna called out in English, his voice carrying to the ridge, a promise of swift and certain retribution. Samuel was trapped, and he knew it, but cornered animals were often the most dangerous. His hand moved toward his gun with the desperate speed of a man who had nothing left to lose. "If I am going down, I am taking her with me." The pistol cleared his holster, swinging menacingly toward Clara. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as she stared down the black barrel of death. She could see Samuel's finger tightening on the trigger, could see the unhinged madness in his eyes. But Ayanna was faster. Despite his grievous wound, despite the gnawing exhaustion, the Apache chief moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior, his body a weapon honed by years of relentless training. His knife left its sheath in a blur of silver, spinning end over end through the scorching air with deadly precision. The blade struck Samuel's wrist with surgical accuracy, severing the tendons and sending a shock of agony through his body. His scream echoed across the desert as the gun tumbled from his nerveless fingers, discharging harmlessly into the sand. Blood gushed from the wound as he clutched his injured hand to his chest, his face contorted in a mask of unimaginable pain. "My wrist!" he shrieked. "He cut clean through my wrist!" Marcus and Dutch sat frozen in their saddles, their faces etched with a mixture of horror and dawning realization. They finally understood that they were completely outmatched. This was not just a wounded Apache. This was a seasoned war chief, a man who had survived countless battles through sheer skill, cunning, and unwavering instinct. If you were Clara, what would you do? Stay silent and let others dictate your fate, or seize control of the situation, and demand justice for the unspeakable crimes Samuel had committed against you. Clara's voice cut through Samuel's agonized screams like a lightning strike. "I want him to know what it feels like." Ayanna turned to her, his gaze filled with newfound respect. The broken, terrified girl who had been tied to a tree was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who had found a core of steel within the depths of betrayal. "What are you talking about?" Samuel gasped, his voice choked with pain and fear as he clutched his bleeding wrist. Clara slid gracefully down from Ayanna's horse, her legs surprisingly steady beneath her. "You left me to die alone. You wanted me to experience the full spectrum of fear, to drown in utter helplessness. Now it is your turn." "Clarabelle," Ayanna said softly, his voice laced with a hint of warning. "What do you ask of me?" "Tie him to that tree," she said, her voice unwavering, pointing to the skeletal remains of the mesquite that had been her prison. "The same way he tied me. Let him feel the relentless burn of the sun on his skin. Let him know the agonizing torment of thirst. Let him finally understand what he attempted to do to me." Marcus and Dutch exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the outcome they had envisioned. They had ridden out expecting a straightforward rescue, perhaps a bit of Apache bashing. They had not anticipated witnessing Samuel's depraved crimes, nor had they expected the wave of nausea and self-loathing that washed over them as they contemplated their own complicity. "Now hold on," Dutch stammered, his voice laced with discomfort. "We cannot just leave a white man tied up for the vultures. That is barbaric." "Why not?" Clara's voice was as cold and unyielding as granite. "He left a white woman tied up for them. What makes his life inherently worth more than mine?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, a direct assault on everything they had been taught about the inherent value of human life. Samuel was white, male, and a landowner, ticking all the boxes of privilege. By every metric their society used to measure worth, he should matter more than an orphaned girl. But gazing at Clara's raw, rope-burned wrists and the fading bruises on her shoulders, those deeply ingrained measures seemed hollow and meaningless. Ayana spoke to his brother on the ridge in rapid Apache. The warrior responded with equal urgency, and Ayana nodded in agreement. Nalnish says 3 more of our people are on their way. They will be here soon. You have until then to decide what justice looks like. Samuel's face turned ashen. You cannot do this. I have rights. I am a citizen of this territory. I own land. You have what you gave me, Clara interrupted, her voice dripping with scorn. Nothing. The stark truth of her words hit Samuel with the force of a physical blow. Everything he had so casually said about her now applied to him. He was alone, stripped of his power, unprotected, and at the mercy of the very people he had so casually wronged. For the first time in his life, Samuel Crenshaw experienced the crushing weight of utter powerlessness. Please, he whispered, his voice trembling. I will make it right. I will tell everyone what really happened. I will confess to the sheriff. You will what? Clara's laugh was laced with bitterness. You will tell them you attempted to rape an orphan and left her to die when she bravely fought back. Do you honestly believe they will punish you for that? Do you truly think anyone will care about justice for someone like me? Samuel opened his mouth to retort, then snapped it shut. They both knew she spoke the unvarnished truth. In a world where women like Clara were considered disposable, men like Samuel faced no consequences for their actions. But this was not that world anymore. This was the lawless expanse of the desert, where a different set of rules applied, where an Apache chief could act as both judge and jury, and where a seemingly broken girl could demand her own form of justice. Marcus finally found his voice, his bravado gone, replaced by a nervous tremor. What do you want from us? Clara fixed her gaze on the 2 men who had ridden out with Samuel, expecting to be hailed as heroes. I want you to ride back to town. I want you to tell everyone exactly what you witnessed here today. Tell them Samuel Crenshaw confessed to attacking me. Tell them he attempted to murder me when I resisted his advances. And then what? Dutch asked, his voice barely a whisper. Then you forget you ever saw me alive. The full implications of her words dawned on them both simultaneously. Clara was not simply demanding justice for Samuel's heinous crimes. She was planning to vanish completely, to walk away from a world that had never offered her anything but pain and rejection. But as the distinct sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, as more Apache warriors materialized on the horizon, Clara sensed that her carefully constructed plan might be far more complicated than she had anticipated. Ayana was watching her with an unreadable expression, and something in the depths of his dark eyes suggested that her story was far from over. 3 Apache warriors crested the ridge, their horses moving like phantoms against the fiery backdrop of the desert. Clara watched them approach, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. These were not the savage monsters from the terrifying bedtime stories that white mothers used to scare their children into obedience. These were men of unwavering dignity and quiet purpose, their faces etched with the same quiet strength and fierce determination she had witnessed in Ayana. The lead warrior spoke rapidly to Ayana in their native tongue, his words sharp and urgent. Clara caught the questioning tone, the unmistakable concern for their chief's potentially life-threatening wound. Ayana responded, gesturing first toward Samuel and then toward Clara. The warrior's eyes narrowed as they took in the full extent of her injuries. The raw, weeping rope burns, the dark bruises, the obvious signs of a brutal assault. "What are they saying?" Marcus whispered, his voice laced with fear. "They are deciding whether you live or die," Ayana said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. Dutch's horse pranced nervously beneath him, sensing the palpable tension in the air. "We did not do anything to the girl. That was all Samuel." "You rode with him," Ayana stated, his voice a low rumble. "You came here with the intention of killing me for saving her life. In their eyes, you share his guilt." Clara felt the weight of their intense stares, the desperate hope flickering in Marcus and Dutch's eyes. These were the same men who had been ready to murder her just hours before, the same men who had labeled her worthless, tainted, and deserving of her fate. Now, they were begging for mercy from the very people they had been taught to despise and fear. The lead warrior dismounted and approached Samuel, who was still clutching his mangled wrist, writhing in agony. Blood had soaked through his shirt, and his face was a ghastly shade of gray from shock and terror. The Apache warrior studied him with the same detached curiosity a hunter might employ when examining a wounded animal, assessing its potential threat. "Nalnish asks what punishment would befit this heinous crime," Ayana translated, his voice devoid of judgment. Samuel's voice cracked, his bravado completely evaporated. "I will do anything. I will give you money, horses, whatever you want." "What I want," Clara said, stepping forward, her voice resonating with newfound strength, "is for you to finally understand that I am not nothing, that I matter, that what you did to me was wrong, and that it carries consequences. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." Samuel looked up at her, his gaze finally meeting hers without contempt, perhaps for the first time since they had met. He saw the quiet strength in her bearing, the unwavering fire in her eyes that hours of torture and humiliation had failed to extinguish. For a fleeting moment, something akin to shame flickered across his twisted features. I did not think. You did not think I was human," Clara finished for him, her voice laced with scorn. "You saw something you could exploit and discard without consequence, but I am still here, still breathing, still worth something." The Apache warriors spoke among themselves, their voices low and somber. Clara could not understand their words, but she could feel the weight of their judgment hanging heavy in the air. These men had witnessed enough injustice in their lives to recognize it when they saw it. Ayana swayed slightly in his saddle, and Clara realized that his wound was far more serious than she had initially thought. Dark blood had soaked through the crude bandage wrapped around his shoulder, and his breathing was becoming increasingly labored. He needed immediate medical attention, needed to reach his village and receive the skilled care of his people before the encroaching infection claimed his life. "You are hurt," she said, moving to his side, her voice filled with concern. "You should leave. Let me deal with Samuel." Ayana looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Respect, admiration, and something far deeper, something that hinted at an unspoken connection, a feeling that suggested he had no intention of leaving her behind. "You would come with us?" he asked quietly, his dark eyes searching hers, seeking an answer that would alter the course of both their lives. The question hung in the desert air like a challenge, a direct confrontation with everything Clara had ever known. To abandon the white world that had so cruelly rejected her, to embrace a people she had been taught to fear, to trade one uncertain future for another that was shrouded in mystery. But before she could formulate a response, Nalnish spoke sharply, pointing towards the distant horizon. More riders were approaching from the direction of town, a considerable force. "Soldiers," Ayana breathed, his face hardening. Samuel's bloody face contorted into a triumphant grin. "I informed the sheriff of my intentions, told him I might require backup if there was any trouble with hostiles." The trap was closing around them, the jaws tightening with each passing second. In a matter of minutes, they would be completely surrounded by cavalry, hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. Clara looked at Ayana, at the brave warriors who had risked their lives to save a white girl they did not even know. She weighed the gravity of the choice before her, considering the two worlds that were pulling her in such drastically different directions, and she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Clara snatched Samuel's fallen pistol from the sand, checking the chambers with calm, practiced hands. She had watched her father meticulously clean and maintain his weapons countless times, and she knew enough to make this work. 4 bullets remained. "What are you doing?" Ayana asked, his voice laced with a hint of concern, but also a flicker of understanding. "Buying you time to escape," Clara replied, her voice remarkably calm and resolved. "When those soldiers arrive, they will find me holding Samuel at gunpoint. I will tell them he attacked me, that I managed to escape and capture him myself. They will never believe you overpowered him alone, Dutch protested, his voice filled with disbelief. Clara smiled grimly, a hint of defiance in her eyes. They will believe whatever they want to believe. A white girl heroically defending herself sounds far more palatable than an Apache war chief saving her from the clutches of white men. Samuel's eyes widened with sheer panic. You cannot do this. I will tell them the truth. Will you? Clara pressed the cold barrel of the pistol harder against his temple, silencing his protests. You will confess to attempted rape, to leaving me tied up to die under the scorching sun. Do you truly believe that will make you look any better? The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew deafening. Clara could see the swirling dust clouds rising from the thundering hooves of multiple horses, indicating a sizable force of at least a dozen riders. The cavalry was coming in force, fully expecting a battle. Ayanna struggled to dismount, his wound bleeding profusely. No, I will not leave you to face this alone. Yes, you will, Clara countered, her voice carrying the unwavering authority of someone who had finally discovered her purpose in life. Because if you remain, we all perish. If you escape, at least some of us will survive. Nalnish spoke urgently to Ayanna, gesturing emphatically toward the approaching soldiers. The other warriors were already preparing to retreat, their horses prancing with nervous energy, sensing the impending danger. Clarabelle, Ayanna said softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There is something you should know. What is it? In my language, your name signifies clear water in the desert. It represents hope when there should be none. The profound words struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering her carefully constructed defenses. She had spent her entire life believing she was worthless, unwanted, utterly insignificant. But this man, this Apache chief who barely knew her, saw her as a symbol of hope itself. I cannot go with you, she whispered, her voice trembling. I do not belong in your world any more than I belonged in theirs. You belong wherever you choose to belong, Ayanna countered, his voice filled with quiet conviction. The first soldiers crested the ridge, their blue uniforms a stark contrast against the backdrop of red rock and sand. Clara raised the pistol high, making certain they could clearly see her holding Samuel at gunpoint. Go! She shouted, her voice laced with urgency. Finally, reluctantly, Ayanna allowed Nalnish to assist him onto his horse. The Apache warriors melted into the rugged landscape like shadows, disappearing among the rocks and canyons with the instinctive skill of men born to this harsh land. Clara was alone once more, but this time, it felt different. This time, she had consciously chosen her solitude, embracing it as a shield against a world that had never accepted her. Help! She called out to the approaching soldiers, her voice laced with desperation. This man attacked me. I have captured him. Sergeant McKinnon was the first to reach them, his weathered face etched with suspicion. Behind him rode a dozen cavalry troopers, their carbines at the ready, prepared for any eventuality. Miss, are you unharmed? Clara allowed tears to stream down her cheeks, not entirely feigned. He tied me up, left me to die. I managed to break free when he returned. I got his gun away from him. Samuel attempted to speak, but Clara pressed the pistol harder against his skull, effectively silencing him. One word, and I will show them exactly what you attempted to do to me. The sergeant dismounted cautiously, approaching her with a measured gait. Let me take the weapon, miss. You are safe now. Clara relinquished the pistol, watching as two soldiers grabbed Samuel and swiftly bound his hands. He was ranting incoherently about Apache attacks, but his story made little sense. A wounded man babbling about savage natives while a young woman stood over him, armed with his own weapon, did not paint a convincing picture. What is your name, miss? McKinnon asked gently, his eyes filled with concern. Clara Bell. I have no family. This man offered to help me find work in the next town, but when we got to the desert, she allowed her voice to trail off, gesturing to the raw welts circling her wrists. McKinnon's face darkened as he examined her injuries. And so Clara's incredible story takes a turn, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. the unexpected bonds that can form in the face of adversity, and the courage it takes to forge your own destiny, even when the path ahead is uncertain. It's a story about finding strength where you thought you had none and recognizing humanity, even in those you've been taught to fear. What did you think of Clara's choices? Did she do the right thing? What do you think the future holds for her and Ayana? I'd love to hear your thoughts, your interpretations, and any questions you might have, so please leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this and want to explore more stories filled with adventure, heart, and unexpected twists, please subscribe. That way, you won't miss any of our future content. We have so many more journeys to embark on together.